please welcome our final speaker for the day, the brilliant Terry Mathis.
Welcome to everyone who's attending the conference this morning.
Yeah, great to have you with us, Terry. Many thanks. So listen, I know in just a moment you're going to be talking us through some of these ideas about how to improve safety culture and some of the learnings that you've seen. Before we get to that, obviously, this has been, a year of change. We've obviously seen the impact of COVID on the health and safety space. Let's get some thoughts from you on how that has changed perceptions around the health and safety community. Has it raised awareness as to its importance? Have you guys seen, renewed attention from both management and workers alike?
Oh, absolutely so. This is complicated. It's almost divided the efforts in safety, because not only do you have to do the traditional things you were doing in safety, but you have to do COVID safety also. And then somehow you have to marry those two efforts together. And it's been quite a challenge for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can speak for everybody, I'm sure, when I say that we all appreciate the efforts that you folks and everybody here at the conference is doing to keep us all safe. So, Terry, we're going to be back with some questions from the audience towards the end of the session. But for now, I'm going to hand over to you to walk us through your ideas. Terry, over to you.
All right. Thank you. We're talking about safety culture and how COVID has impacted it. Let me start this by saying some really controversial things, okay? First of all, any strategy that you develop for safety pre-COVID is no longer reliable. Any assessment you did of your safety culture pre-COVID is no longer reliable. That doesn't mean that it's wrong, doesn't mean that it's all wrong. It means it's not reliable because things have changed. And here's the sad truth about this. We are not going to go back to exactly the normal that we talked about before. There's going to be a new normal, and you're going to have to adjust to it, or it's going to ambush you and cause you all kinds of grief here in the near future. So if you're thinking things are going to go back and be exactly like they were before, you're really deceiving yourselves. Things have changed. Like any traumatic event that changes your attitude, your approach to the world, COVID has done that. So if you'll, the next slide kind of ask you the question, did your safety culture catch COVID? And I'll bet it did. You caught it one way or the other. But then the next slide is going to ask you an even deeper question. Did your safety culture survive COVID? And if you're here today, I'm kind of assuming that it did, although some of you may be here starting all over again from scratch with new companies or new organizations or whatever. But if you survived COVID, what you're going to find is, like every survivor of COVID, even as a disease, your safety culture caught it. Your safety culture is going to have some of the lasting impacts of it. So as one of the authors, interesting story, several years ago, J. Wiley & Sons, one of the more prestigious scientific publishers, came to me and said, Terry, we've been reading your blogs and your podcast, and you need to write a book on safety culture. And I said, well, I wrote one in 1993, and nobody wanted to read it back then. They all wanted to talk about behavior rather than culture. And they said, yes, but what you're saying is very relevant. And I said, there are 12 other books on safety culture out there already right now besides mine. And they said, no, there's actually 13. So I had to read the other book before I wrote this last one. But they said, everybody else is telling you how to describe a safety culture, how to analyze a safety culture. They're not telling you how to improve one. And that's what we're reading in your blogs and podcasts, is how to improve a safety culture. So anyway, I wrote the book called Steps to Safety Culture Excellence. And a lot of the information I'm going to bring you today, it comes from that book, although really what I'm going to present is more specific to the slides. But let me share just a few ideas from that. First of all, on this next slide, it's going to ask you, what is a safety culture? And theoretically, there's no such thing. Okay, cultures don't form around topics like safety or quality or anything. They form around a group of people. And if culture is a bit of a mysterious term to you, substitute the word common. But don't use the definition of common as everyday. Use the definition of common as shared. A culture is something that a group of people share. And what they share are basically perceptions, values, practices, And when those become common to a group of people, you have a culture. So any group of people that have been working together for any period of time already have a culture. And the safety aspect of that is what we've kind of separated out, like scientists tend to do, so we can study it in isolation, even though if we really pay attention, we understand it doesn't work in isolation. It's impacted by all these other things. So what does impact a safety culture? Well, that's what I put up on the next slide over here. Basically, the three things that I wanted to talk to you about today. There are others, by the way, but these are the three things I wanted to talk to you about today. Culture is not a construct. It's not an engineering thing. It's organic. It grows like a plant. So if you think about a plant, what does it take to make a plant grow? You have to control the climate and the chemistry, right? The plant has to have the right temperature, has to have the right amount of sunshine. The soil that you plant it in has to have the right nutrients to grow it. That's what forms a culture. And that's why so many people are unsuccessful at shaping or improving their culture, because they're approaching it directly. It's an indirect thing to change your culture. You don't change your culture. You change the climate and chemistry, and your culture grows within that climate and chemistry. But ultimately, a culture is formed by its members. And I wanted to show you kind of how that works. This is the only diagram I'm going to share with you from the book. But on this next slide over here, think about how people influence each other. This is an interesting concept and one that a lot of people misunderstand, but this is going to give you a basis for how you can address your culture change after COVID. So here's what happens. People come into your culture. Picture a new employee coming into your culture. They have perceptions. If you've ever heard the old saying that perception is reality, I'm sorry, totally false. I couldn't disagree with that if it were twice as wrong. Perceptions are the way people think about things. Reality is the way things really are. You can perceive that it's snowing outside right now, but if it's not, your perception's inaccurate. And these are the two kinds of perceptions, accurate and inaccurate. Perceptions impact something called attitudes, which are really tricky things. I have a lot of people that say, boy, Terry, it's hard to change somebody's attitude. No, it's not. Walk up to somebody and say, I want to talk to you about your attitude, and you'll change it almost instantly. Not the way you probably intended to. But perceptions impact attitudes. Attitudes impact values. Values are what we think are important. And what we think is important impacts the decisions that we make, especially on the job. Now, also, and it kind of works backwards both ways, when we make decisions, we have expectations. We think if we make this kind of decision, this is probably what will happen. Those expectations turn into our behaviors, and our behaviors create experiences. We share experiences within a culture, especially by telling stories, by telling other people what happened. Those stories either reinforce or challenge that original perception. So a worker comes to work for your company and he perceives that safety is a very important thing in your company. He develops a safety attitude. He develops safety values. He has to make a decision of whether to be safe or whether to really hurry the job up. And he decides that what you want him to do is make that safe decision. So he makes that decision, and what happens? Well, if his boss comes along and says, way to go, man, good job, that was really exactly what the company wants you to do, he's going to tell those stories. That's going to reinforce this perception that safety is a high value. Now, what if on the other hand, he makes all these decisions, just like I took you through the chain to there, and his boss comes along and says, what the hell took so long? This is going to challenge that perception of how important safety is in your organization, and he's going to tell stories. You probably know, too, that people tell horror stories more than they tell good stories. So if something really bad happens to you, you go to a really bad restaurant, you warn all your friends not to go there, right? If you go to a really good restaurant, you may tell a few people and invite them over or whatever. But this is what happens with the culture. This is how a culture forms and reforms, and this is how it norms itself. So understanding that, how these people impact the culture, think about this. If your culture caught COVID, here's what happens on the next slide over here. If you've had COVID, if you actually caught the disease itself, the next slide has a list of what you're going to see over here. If you caught COVID, even if you get rid of it, even if you survive it, there are some lasting, lingering side effects of COVID. And they include fatigue, cough, shortness of breath, headaches, joint pain, some things like this. These are things that people experience even after they've recovered. What's your culture going to experience even after it's recovered from COVID at some point out there in the future? The focus is going to be changed, or it's going to be expanded or altered one way or the other. Now, by the way, one of the strengths of COVID, I think, is going to be in teaching your culture how to focus. We looked at what can we do to avoid getting COVID, and we said, let's focus on the three things that are going to make the biggest difference. Let's socially distance, let's wear masks, and let's do hand sanitation on a real regular basis. This is powerful stuff. This is how I've helped a lot of organizations become truly excellent in safety, by making them focus on the handful of things that make the biggest difference. So this is a lesson that's valuable for your culture to have learned, but it's going to change. The focus you had pre-COVID is not going to be the focus you need post-COVID. The other thing is distancing. Your workers have learned that they can't probably work shoulder to shoulder. They've had to do some kind of distancing, some kind of spacing in what they're doing. A lot of your workers, especially a lot of your leaders, have learned to work from home. And this is a real different thing for a lot of folks. Some companies have been doing this for years, but not most. So will you bring all the people from home back to work, or will you let them continue to work at home? This is something to think about. Meeting virtually. One of my longest term clients, I was talking to back in a couple of months into the COVID, and he said, our CEO is telling us he can't wait until we can all get around a table, look at each other face to face, and solve problems again. So this Zoom meeting stuff is really awkward. 2 months later, he's changed his tune, and he's saying, you know what, this Zoom meeting stuff actually works. We can actually make this happen over there. Less direct supervision. You know, supervisors used to be out there, visible on the floor. Some of them did. I mean, in a lot of organizations, supervisors have kind of disappeared into the office, and you never see them out in the workplace anymore. But in most organizations, there was some kind of interaction, direct interaction between the supervisors and the workers. A lot of that went away with COVID, or got modified one way or the other. So anyway, with this little list like that, and I'm going to add a couple at the end of it over here too that I think are pertinent. Let's talk about each one of these in just a little bit more detail. So on the next slide, we're talking about focus. What is focus? Have you ever talked about getting people on the same page? You know why a lot of organizations don't have people on the same page? They don't have a page. If you think about it, if you ask your workers, if you ask your safety professionals, what one thing, if everybody did it differently, would make the biggest difference in safety? How many of them are going to give you an intelligent database answer to that question? I've been asking that question for years now, and I don't get a lot of acceptable answers. So here's the thing. When we asked that about COVID, we came up with those top three things. When you ask it about safety, what are your top three things in safety? And are they going to be the same pre-COVID and post-COVID? And I'm guessing no. I'm guessing you're going to need to reassess that. You're going to need to look at that again and determine what your top few things are. You remember this guy named Vilfredo Pareto? Pareto analysis, cause and effect studies like that. Pareto said we'll always have a significant few and a trivial many. Are you working on all these little things that are going to make a little difference in safety, or are you working on the few things that are going to make the huge difference in safety? It's the same amount of work for either one and a lot more results. On the next slide, I'm talking about distancing. And this is kind of an interesting thing that's happened to a lot of workplaces. It's happened to a lot of social places too. You know, when we went into restaurants after COVID, after things opened up a little bit, they didn't fill every table. You couldn't sit at the bar shoulder to shoulder like you did before. We had to space everything out a little bit. You know, as we started learning how COVID was spread, we started realizing that getting too close together was going to cause a shared event with COVID also. So we started distancing. I think we've gotten used to distancing, and I think people are not as comfortable being too close as they were before. And I think that's a habit that's going to go on in your culture even after COVID is all over. So can you facilitate that in your workplace? Will this facilitate this kind of change in your culture? Can you distance people while they're doing work out there? The next one is working from home. This is really an interesting thing. Now, in my company, we've been doing this for years. We became a virtual company a number of years ago. What happened? I traveled so much back in the early days of forming this company that when I got home, I didn't want to go to the office. And when I quit coming into the office, my senior partner said, well, if you don't come in, why do I have to come in? And a few months after that, all of the other people in the office said, well, if you guys don't come in, why do we have to come in? And we sat down and actually had a physical meeting, and we said, you know what? We don't. We don't have to do that. Now with things like VoIP phones and computer sharing and Zoom, as it started coming out and everything, we said, you know, we don't have to do this. We can actually operate without all this physical travel. And we're a safety company. So what we realized was the greatest safety risk we take is when we get on the highway and drive to the office. So why do we want to take that risk right now? Now, if you've sent a bunch of your executives home and found out they can meet in Zoom meetings, they can supervise their people at distance, are you going to put that back together, or is that going to be a permanent change afterwards? There's no right or wrong to that question, but there is a right and left, and you're going to have to make a choice. And after you see how COVID has impacted your people, that's the best time to make that particular choice. The next slide, we talk about less direct supervision. Are people going to be out there supervising like they have been in the past? You know what we've found? There's been some incredible creativity in how this is going on. The reason I put a little smartphone out here is because you know what some of my more clever clients are doing? They're supervising online. They're supervising their people through iPhones, through smart devices. They're giving the instructions, they're getting feedback. They're looking at what's going on out there. I've got people who are holding up an iPhone with the camera on to their supervisor, showing them what this gauge reads and what this gauge reads. And the supervisor saying, okay, we're a little bit over on this. We need to adjust back. This is being done in a really interesting, clever way. Now, after we've gotten used to doing this for months, are we going to go back to the old way of doing it, or are we going to keep this new way of doing it? Again, no right or wrong to this question, just right or left. Which way are you going to choose? Which way makes the most sense? Did we discover something new in the technology while COVID was out there? And in general, the answer to that is no. All this technology was already there. COVID didn't invent this technology. It didn't introduce this technology. It just pushed this technology. It made us go to it because we didn't have any other choice. And now that we've gone to it, I think there's a lot of it we're going to say, ooh, that makes sense. That's actually a little bit better than it was before. When I adjusted for my clients, just after COVID started, I said, I can deliver this training, I can deliver this consulting service to you on a Zoom meeting. And they said, will that work? Can we really do it that way? How much less will it cost? Well, interestingly, over the next 2 or 3 months, they answered those questions for themselves. Even though I was trying to feed them some information, they realized that by doing Zoom meetings themselves, that Zoom meetings could be very effective, that Zoom training could be very effective, that Zoom consulting could be effective. And as they discovered this, they also discovered that, like right now, I'm working with a company in the UK, I'm working with a company in Malaysia. Unlike what would have happened a year and a half or 2 years ago, I have not flown to the UK and I have not flown to Malaysia. And if you look at what a business class ticket cost to one of those places, there's the answer to the first question, right? How much less is this going to cost? Travel cost. You buy me a business class ticket to London and then rent me a car to drive up to your site, then put me up in a hotel and buy me meals and everything else. Is that really better than getting me on a Zoom meeting and letting me teach your people there? And what they're finding out is no, it's not that much better. It's not worth the additional cost. So are we going to go back to that afterwards? Gives me a little bit of fear for the airlines. Are the airlines ever going to go back up to the level of business that they had before? Are you as a company going to fly as many people around to as many different meetings as you used to? Or are you going to use this technology? And is that going to permanently change the way your culture interacts with each other? There are cultures in social media. A lot of people have a Facebook culture. A lot of people have a Twitter culture. A lot of people have, various, whatever technology you're using online. You get a group of people together, they start sharing things, they start interacting with each other. A lot of companies are trying their best to form that kind of culture online because they know the interconnectivity isn't going to be what it was before. So are you looking at that? Are you thinking about that? Are you planning for that in your company's future? I'm talking about now consulting and meetings and things like that. But on the next slide over here, what I wanted you to think about was training and consulting methods. Again, I'm a consultant, so this is very near to my heart. I'm a trainer also. So I'm training people in the UK to do a particular safety process. I'm training people in Malaysia to do a different safety process. I'm also training people in North Dakota, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in Denmark right now to do different safety processes. Training online works. Now, I had to learn some tricks. I had to learn some things because training online tends to be more like what we're doing right now. It tends to be a talk, an information dump. You have to learn how to get your people involved online and give them something to do, get them engaged in the training so they actually don't just learn information, but they learn skills and they can actually go out and practice what they've learned afterwards. So basically what I'm saying over here, as we get to the end of this, is that I kind of made a graphic for you on this next slide over here that I wanted you to think about a little bit. I couldn't quite come up with exactly what to illustrate the point that I was trying to make. So here's my point. If you'll look at it, this is a poker table and all the chips are off. So here's my point. If you're thinking about what your safety culture is going to be post-COVID, if you're thinking about what your safety strategy needs to be post-COVID, all the chips are off the table. Everything that you've done up to this point, everything that you've assumed, everything that you've assessed, everything that you have strategically planned is potentially going to change. Now, here's the thing. The talk today is entitled, this super challenge that we're going to make out here. The challenge is yet to come. And the challenge is not going to be an event. The challenge wasn't COVID as such, although that was the founder of the change out here. It's not going to be an event. It's going to be a process. Or for those of you in the UK, it's going to be a process, okay? But it's the same thing. One of my heroes in life, a man named W. Edwards Deming, the man who invented statistical process control and started teaching us the real fundamentals of quality in our manufacturing and service delivery, said, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. So here's the thing. What is the process by which you're going to determine how COVID has changed your culture and how it ought to continue to change your culture and what this thing that we're calling the new normal really is? So basically, here are my suggestions for how you do that on the next slide over here. Let me mention two other things that came up today. One of the problems with a conference like this is when they ask you to send your slides in ahead of time. They don't get the stuff that you learned 30 minutes before you made your presentation. You don't have time to get them into your slides over there. But there are two things that came out in an article that I co-authored that I reread over here. And it just dawned on me that I probably should have mentioned those in this also. One of the things that's going to have happened is not just COVID, but it was the administration change that happened during COVID also, which probably, depending on your political leanings, might have been influenced by COVID and by some of the COVID things that happened. But there's going to be some legal and psychological changes after pre-COVID and pre-election and everything else also. There's going to be a new stress on the psychological changes that have happened to your workforce. And I think you're going to be legally required to provide more psychological counseling, more psychological support, and everything else to your workforce, knowing that they were traumatized to an extent during this period. And, if you look at the increase in suicides, the increase in domestic violence and everything else that happened during this time, although you may say that's not really a work issue, it really is, because these are your people. This is the environment they come from to come to work every day. So you're going to have to take a look at that and work with that. But here's my suggestions, kind of a process for you to get yourself back to normal. List the COVID changes that have impacted your organization. Really sit down and think about these things. What has COVID changed? And I think these are, even though the list I've just given you, the things we've just discussed are some of the main points, they're certainly not the only points. This is not an all-inclusive list of things that can happen. So ask yourself, how have we changed since COVID? How are we doing business differently than we did pre-COVID? Customize a perception and cultural survey. Now, this can be a paper survey, it can be an online survey, it can be an interview, an informal survey, but ask your people. Here's the thing, Deming also, one of my heroes, if you haven't guessed already, said, people support what they help create. You want your new culture to have a maximum amount of participation from the members of it in reforming it post-COVID. So find out what they're thinking. Find out what this is all about. Don't just have them fill out a piece of paper or an online survey like that. Interview them also. Now, if you can do the paper or the survey first, and look what your main issues are that come out of that, and then in your interviews, probe and ask about that. Say, well, you told us that training is really not what it ought to be since COVID started. Tell us how it could be better. Tell us what you think we ought to do with that. Get their input and get it in person as well as on paper. So after you've done all this, sit down in a strategic leadership meeting and strategically decide how COVID has impacted your organization and how you ought to deal with that into the future. Some of these changes are good. Some of these changes are going to last and actually be improvements over what you've been doing. But think strategically. Safety is not strategic in the US, especially right now. Most of the organizations I go to don't have a safety strategy. They say they do, but all they got is a bunch of safety programs that they're throwing at their safety problem. That's not strategy. That's just programmatic. Programmatic is almost the opposite of strategic. Once you've got your strategy in place, part of strategy is measurement. How are you going to know if this is working? Determine some metrics, picture what success is going to look like, and measure your progress toward it. Thanks, everybody. Best wishes for safety.
Yeah, same to you, Terry. Take care.